Finnegans Wake took James Joyce 17 years to write, and in that time, when it was being published serially, it was called Work in Progress. And in the Wake, Joyce goes to great lengths to pun on that name, and specifically to pun on the name of the title of a group of essays published by his contemporaries called Our Examination Round His Factification for Incamination of Work in Progress. And that receives a number of attention, and in particular I want to focus on one of the passages that distantly puns on that essay collection title, but also gets to the very heart of the Wake's ability to self-reflexively appraise and describe itself. On page 284, we might well say that the Wake is to be the continuation through regeneration of the utteration of the word in Pregross. I would like to focus on this passage in detail because I think it gets to the heart of how Joyce viewed Finnegans Wake and also the role of the artistic process in creating and gestating this work. Because I think Joyce was very much against the idea of the finality of any work, and he was always, therefore, seeing life as a work in progress, and therefore deeply aesthetic in its very ontological core, that life is art and art is life. So he saw something very much vivifying about both the creation and publication of Finnegans Wake, and therefore I think it's really critical that we hold on to little passages like this as respite for the reader who might get lost, and also really see how passages such as this have such key details for understanding the implications of Joyce's work in Pregross. Important for reading and interpreting Finnegans Wake is that every detail which is changed from how we would expect to see it is important. Joyce is playing on our expectations and being satisfied in their deferral and their augmentation and their truncation. So continuation here becomes continuation, which is important because this brings us into the musical and the sonic realm with tones, right? We continue to tone, which is to say to recite this work in progress. So here at the very heart of Finnegans Wake is the aural by extension, but also the vocal and the idea of speech. It is occurring through regeneration, which is hearkening to the continual idea of cyclicality. I think also of Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence of the same. I think also of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. All of this seems to be at the very aesthetic core of Finnegans Wake. And then it is a regeneration of the utteration, right? Is German for original or primary or some sort of ancient origin. So this is the utteration. So this is like the first word spoken of in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And then this is a word in Pregross. And Pregross here is very interesting because we have to note that when Joyce makes these portmanteau words, they both exist as they are, and they hearken to the environs of our language, to what we would expect to be there, and what we can still sense is there and is being punned on. That's the great thing about Joyce's language, is that it is so hyper-compacted that it can be both itself and what it is not. And it can very plausibly be, right? It can very plausibly be saying work in progress here. But work has been changed to word. So here we're showing Joyce's obsession with words and language, and therefore with speech, with recitation, with sound. And then in progress, right, instead of progression, which would give this idea of developing teleologically, we have pregross. So we're going back, pre, But back to where? Because Joyce is very critical, classicist as he is, he's very critical of this idea that we just need to go back. That if we merely, I think of Ezra Pound. Pound is much more wedded to this idea of a synthesis that goes back to the past in a bit more of a conservative manner. Of course, this itself is reductive of Pound, and I could go into more detail. But Joyce is trying to go back in order to go forward and to show that we cannot go back absolutely. In a very postmodern way, I think he is wedded to this idea of Jameson's, that there is a collapse of history itself, both in our theory and our pedagogy and our aesthetics of history, that we cannot recover some absolutely unmediated, unfettered, untainted historical origin of our word. So, right, when we're trying to find the original word that is spoken, which is, in the Christian sense, the logos, Jesus and God himself, the very justification for and valorization of language itself and the authorization of its value, Joyce doesn't really think that we can get some sort of unmediated access to the truth of language like that. Instead, we are always going pregross, which is to say before the German groß, large or big. So before the high moments of the development of culture, of language, of ideology, of thought, of age, etc. Because, throughout Finnegans Wake, he's playing on this idea of Vico's cycles of history, which, ascend in civility from the divine to the heroic to the human and then to the chaotic, which cycles back. So we're seeing this development of human society. And then Joyce is also showing how this is relevant to the gestation of individual beings rising from their earliest moments of conception through to childhood, adulthood, old age, and then eventual death. So we can see in Pregross, we're going before the gross moments of humanity, of what it means to be high, and therefore also of high literature. We're going before that, but not necessarily in a sense which antedates those. It's a sense of the before which is concurrent with every now. It is the low which is concurrent with every high. And the grounds upon which every high claims to justify itself is to ostracize and on the back of, standing on the back of that low, to authorize itself. But also, what's really interesting here is instead of progression, of progress, we seem to have an intimation of a false start of this word P, like we're beginning to pronounce progress, but instead we get regross, regrets. So it's like we're saying regross. We could almost imagine some sort of glottal stop after the P here. Because, of course, we can interpolate a lot vocally as we recite Finnegans Wake that allows us to potentially penetrate into alternate layers of meaning, which are not necessarily forbidden by the text. Because, right, there's nothing in the text that necessarily forbids us from adding a glottal stop anywhere we would like in the entirety of the text. And that's really interesting because we can see that while Joyce, of course, is not authorizing this, it's very interesting that he would change the spelling at all. And we need to take him seriously that different parts of the word could be segmented not only in their meaning, but in their orthography. We can take different sections and realize that really this P at the beginning of progress, right, it is a plosive. It is a moment of articulation, but every articulation is a false start for Joyce. It always immediately is disseminating beyond what it claims to be its limits, and it is always speaking in more ways than one. It is always letting on more than it appears to, and every progretic action, every act of progress, which would seem to be prophetic, is in fact also a moment of regress. And I think Joyce wants to keep these two concurrent with each other, as he does in this portmanteau word, because here progress and regress seem to be latent in the same word. And of course, to me, in Pregross, regression seems to be the meaning that is winning out, orthographically and hermeneutically. And yet progress is still there by way of association. So we're not losing that. And this is really important, this idea of the false start, because if we look at the critical reception of James Joyce, for example, in the Critical Heritage series, we can see a lot of the ways that his artistic process was being talked about, and also the way that Joyce talked about his own artistic process. For example, in a letter to Robert McAlmon, Joyce quite healthily admits his doubts, saying, "Do you think I may be on the wrong track with my work in progress? Miss Weaver says she finds me a madman. Tell me frankly, McAlmon, no man can say for himself." All of this is very interesting because no man can say for himself would seem to forestall this idea that any one man, including himself, could really give the final say on whether or not Joyce was mad. And we might say whether or not Finnegans Wake is a novel or literature at all. I think this is really what Joyce is trying to say is up to a community of inquirers who are proferring opinions and who are bouncing back and forth off of each other. And therefore, his progress is always amidst a community and always a source of doubt for him because of that, because it means that no man is an island, which means that he is beholden to a community, and this is a source of anxiety, and also because it means that the individual artist cannot simply sit satisfied with their own conception of their work. They must prefer it to others in order to be read and to be interpreted. Additionally, if we're looking at Pregross and we're looking at this idea of, burrowing into the before of literature, Joyce says, "I feel like an engineer boring through a mountain from two sides. If my calculations are correct, we shall meet in the middle. If not," and he trails off and leaves us on an important cliffhanger there, right? So here Joyce is analogizing his work to a physical object and to a natural object, which is a mountain, which is itself part of a geologic process of development. And we're coming at it at a particular moment, and we are inciting some kind of action, which comes at it not from one angle, but from many. It seeks to deal a death blow to this idea of the right way, therefore the right way of interpretation and of composition. And in place, he hopes that we would meet in the middle, that we would come to some sort of mutual understanding or reconciliation. But the not yet seems crucial here, in fact, more crucial than the orthodox position of there being some sort of reconciliation or synthesis in terms of art. Here we have the idea that maybe there might not be, or that there is some productive things that we can be doing in this space left open to us. Joyce is purposely leaving open for us the space of interpretation itself. And I think that he is trying to show us that, just as he's saying here, he hopes that this would be articulated and accepted and understood, but he also understands that not understanding can be just as interesting, just as exciting. And therefore, Finnegans Wake's work in progress in going to the utteration of the word in Pregross is searching for a word which is always telling itself and never complete. It's really a making immanent of the transcendent logos. And instead of being satisfied with this idea of a privileged word, every word is already hearkening to a past that it is trying to understand, trying to reconcile with itself, just as Joyce, as the artist, was trying to reconcile with himself in the process of developing his work in progress. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful in thinking about these ideas. I think this is a really fascinating passage from my favorite book. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me, and I appreciate every time someone donates. It helps me get the books necessary to provide y'all content. But no pressure, worry about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.